This right here is an empty property. It's been like this for a few years, and there are many more thousands like it. There are 100,000 empty homes in Metro Melbourne alone, and apparently there's about 4,000 of these empty lots, although I couldn't find this listed anywhere, so it also doesn't count government land that's intentionally kept empty either. So in a time of housing crisis, when housing seems so inaccessible for so many people, why is there so much abundant land and empty properties throughout Melbourne and throughout Australia?
Get on the housing, get on the housing, get on the housing.
Australia is a property owning nation to its core. Right at the outset of colonisation, empty farmland was being speculated on and almost caused an economic crash right at the bat. Fortunately, the colonial governments could prolong said crash until the 1890s, when the long land boom ended and the property market collapsed, causing Australia's worst depression on record, which definitely isn't foreshadowing. This is arguably where the Australian dream was born, as in the 20th century, people increasingly fled inner city rentals to buy up suburban homes that they owned. This was the normalized ideal all the way up to the 1980s. Lots of things changed in the 80s, chiefly the way we do finances in this country. Bob Hawke's Labor government deregulated the economy and the financial sector, which made it much easier for people and investors to access loans and put the money where they saw fit. Now, you may think, great, more autonomy for people get to vote with their dollar. However, this meant people with more dollars got more votes. The housing market booms in the 1980s as a result, primarily to the benefit of investors and developers. The sudden influx of free-flowing credit and investors juiced up the economy to the point where Bob Hawke's treasurer, Paul Keating, was awarded the Best Treasurer of the Year. However, just like the land boom in the 1890s, the economy overextended and it came crashing down, in arguably Australia's worst recession in modern memory. Keating called it the recession we had to have, but that was just an excuse and something specifically outlawed as abhorrent by Labor in 1983.
This is a beautiful set of numbers for us. For policy, Mr. Speaker, give him a Valium.
In any case, the outcome arguably of this era of deregulation was the normalization of an investor-driven economy.
In New South Wales, lending to housing investors was roughly equal to lending to first home buyers in 1994, at around $15 billion, but has increased to around $120 billion in 2014, whereas first home buyer lending was around $20 billion. That is a 700% growth for housing investors, compared to only 33% growth for first home buyers.
The whole safe as houses moniker really began to materialize. Our whole economy became dependent on the performance of the property market in a new way, which basically means for our economy to not collapse, the housing market needs to be doing overall pretty good, which is how you get graphs like this. And so based on the idea that property values or house prices will always go up, something confirmed by politicians of both major parties in this country,
I also want house prices to be modestly increasing.
No, what Labor's policy will do is lower home values.
We do not achieve that goal by embarking upon policies that will hit the housing market.
So we're not trying to bring down house prices.
It can be quite lucrative to hold onto an empty house or an empty plot of land and maybe sell it off in the future. The Australian dream has thus been extended to owning your own property and some more, with now nearly 20% of households owning 2 or more properties. So we've built an economy with really some perverse incentives. Housing is the bedrock of this economy, which in its financialized state is not a good thing. It's almost as if Australia has a, distinct history of excessive real estate speculation ending in, economy ruining depressions. And so instead of reckoning with that history, we've instead put everything into propping up this market to the tune of trillions. So that's how we've ended up with more than 100,000 empty homes in Metro Melbourne alone. In a state that has 30,000 homeless people with a public housing waiting list of over 60,000 households, clearly something's gone wrong. We have enough homes, we have enough land, we have enough resources and labor to build new homes. We just aren't distributing it in the right way. We're allowing those with the most money and power to unduly influence our society. So what can we do to maybe step towards fixing this problem?
this is a beautiful recession. This is a beautiful recession. This is a beautiful recession.
We first need to recognize that this problem is something symptomatic of a broader systemic issue. This only happens because those who own things, those who have the most wealth, are able to converge with the political class and collaborate at our detriment. And that invokes a much larger societal change, part of which I go over here. Here's some things that the Victorian government could or could have done to alleviate the situation, which are very easy to do, but because of what I've just explained, they choose not to. 1. Seize all vacant properties. Can the government do this legally? Under the 1986 Land Acquisition and Compensation Act, yes it can. In fact, it does it all the time. For its North East Link mega project, for example, it seized dozens of homes and over 100 businesses, and none of these were even empty. I think it's way more justifiable to seize a plot of land that isn't even being used than to seize houses and lands that people actually inhabit, and yet the Victorian government hasn't budged. Plus, it's not unprecedented for the Victorian government to seize empty residential and commercial lots to repurpose it for housing. In the 1980s, the Kane Labor government did exactly that for some sites, notably it repurposed empty factories in Port Melbourne and funded the construction of new housing, which then leads into 2, the funding. Victoria's supposedly big housing build is a meager $5.3 billion. Compare it to the North East Link mentioned before. That's going to cost $26 billion, the Metro Tunnel $13 billion, and the Suburban Rail Loop $200 billion. In fact, the Productivity Commission has said that state governments are allocating too much money and resources towards big infrastructure projects and depriving the housing sector of much needed labour and capital. I'm not saying I oppose things like rail infrastructure. All I'm saying is that there are priorities we ought to be following, and I'd rather everyone in the state have a roof over their head and have, less efficient public transport. I don't think that's an unreasonable opinion. I don't think we have to necessarily choose, but if we had to, I don't think it's that crazy to pick, putting a roof over everyone's head. 3. These homes need to be public. They need to be decommodified. Again, I get more into it here, but we need to ensure that the land, particularly in inner city Melbourne, does not get flogged off to developers who will keep the properties empty or renovate them into luxury apartments. In Preston, for example, the government demolished a public housing estate only to, quietly remove it from the big housing build agenda. It's planning to sell it off to developers, and as of now, it's been empty for years. So these homes need to be homes that are permanently residencies and provided for low costs. There, 3 easy ways to start addressing the housing crisis in this country: seize empty properties, funding and resources, and keep it publicly owned. Unfortunately, this is unlikely to happen, not only because of the forces mentioned above, but unlike the ruling class in this country, we have no mechanism or leverage to use over the government. Even elections, where we ostensibly choose who's in power, they are dominated by media coverage owned and sponsored by corporations, and major political parties who have the money and campaign resources who meet at fine dining events with stakeholders, rich people, to discuss concerns they may have, direct and control the discussion. What then is one way we can build and exert leverage or counterpower? Well, through work. We, or most of us, go to work. We stop working, things aren't produced, the company doesn't make money. Until our demands are met, they don't make money. Now, if we focus that attitude into the construction sector, we could really begin to change things. For example, think what you want about the CFMEU or the AWU, the chief construction unions in this country. But those are the guys that are primarily working on big infrastructure projects. If they said, hey, we are not going to work on your project unless you build these homes first, that's a big move. That's a lot of leverage right there. All of a sudden, the government is forced to pick between abiding by our terms or either not building what they want to build. In the words of former union leader Jack Mundy, it is no point winning great wages and conditions if the world we build chokes us to death. I think that's a sentiment that unions and people broadly should emulate, that there is no point in building a giant road or getting a good EBA if we're doing it in a world where there's thousands of people without the basics in life.